in society and immigrant surveillance, and this panel promises to be just as dynamic and informative. Before introducing the amazing group of panelists here today, just a programming note that if you have a question for our panelists, we'll start off with a discussion among the panelists, but there'll be plenty of time for audience Q&A. Please avail yourself of the Q&A function in Zoom, not the chat function, and that way the questions will get to me and I'll be able to ask them and give life to your insightful inquiries. And with that, it's a real honor for me to introduce this panel on categories of control, the regulation of sexuality in gender. The panel includes some of my personal heroes. Some of them are not only brilliant and incredible activists, but also amazing ice skaters. I've been able to see them on the ice. It's really amazing. Needless to say, when this occurred, I was too chicken to participate. I'll respect everybody's privacy and not identify who I'm talking about. So with that, we are joined by, I'll keep the introductions brief because their full bios are available, but Dr. Alex Hanna is a senior research scientist at Google. Dr. Anna Lauren Hoffmann is an assistant professor at the University of Washington Information School. Avatara Smith-Carrington is the Tyrone Garner Memorial Law Fellow at Lambda Legal, and Gabriel Arkles is senior counsel at the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund Till Death. Avatara, I'm going to let you get us started here. And thank you so much for joining us and all your important work on behalf of queer communities, in particular queer communities of color. Queer people, as you know, and particularly queer people of color, live their lives in webs of administrative and carceral surveillance. And before we dive deeper into a broader discussion of how to potentially subvert that surveillance, subvert those webs, either practically or legally, I was hoping you might start us off and help situate our conversation, particularly with regard to the audience, by describing some of the ways that queer people's lives are monitored and shaped by different surveillance regimes.
Cool, no problem. So really excited to be here. Avatara Smith-Carrington, they, them pronouns. And I'm sorry if there's a ping in the background. Yeah, I've been thinking about, how I've seen, queer and trans folks moving in spaces recently, whether they be physical or digital, and like what it looks like to actually talk about this in relationship to privacy. Because, the running joke amongst some of my friends and I, especially folks who are also like Black, queer, and trans, and then also holding other identities, is like, what does privacy actually look like to us when you're in a space of both like being visible in some ways and hyper visible in some ways, but then also invisible. And so like I was having a conversation with a friend recently about specifically identity documents. And we were just talking about, what it looks like to start talking more about an X marker, but what that means for specific people. So like specifically for Black and brown people who are trans, non-binary, and choosing to have an X marker. And one of my friends said to me something along the lines of like, well, that's an interesting thing for me because I feel like, with regard to a conversation around privacy, I don't actually know what that looks like because in many ways, my privacy is already denied at that point. Like in many ways, there's already a conversation happening around my body, specifically in relationship to race or in relationship to talking about, perceived immigration status or, all these other things. And what does that mean in this grand scheme of things? So, as I've been thinking about like, what does this mean and how is it showing up and like also what's happening in these different areas, I've been thinking about like all these different states and how like you're seeing legislatures like, legislators move to infringe upon the privacy of like trans folks, right? So you're seeing like these pushes in the realm of sports and healthcare to talk about things like sex testing, which I mean, like at the end of the day, like what are you actually discussing? And also, when are we going to be real about like what are you implying and like who are you deciding to police? Because in many ways we talk about it in the sense of like, you know, thinking about gender, but like also you have to start thinking about race, right? And thinking about how race is also playing into who's actually going to be more likely to be policed in that space when we're thinking about sex testing and whatever that is. And then also, you know, again, moving into some of like digital spaces, you know, the one thing that I've also like always thought about is like how a lot of queer and trans folks, a lot of Black and brown queer and trans folks have created homes, have created spaces to organize, have found themselves through like these digital communities, right? And so when we've talked about privacy, I've also like thought about how like in many ways, a lot of us have been like kind of like the miner's canary in a way, because we've been able to flag when there are actually issues around like what we're thinking about with privacy. Like we're able to tell folks like, hey, you know, like the way that Instagram is showing up and how certain bodies are being policed or how certain things are happening for certain communities, but not others. And like, why is it happening more for this community than other communities? And so like, again, there's been like this really interesting thing, at least for me, in the ways that I've been seeing things unfold in both physical and digital spaces. Of course, they often overlap. And, you know, again, I kind of come back to, and I hope that this is making as much sense as I wanted it to make, but I kind of come back to, you know, like for who does privacy actually exist? What does it look like when we're talking about subverting these things? Because I feel like some of us naturally subvert these things because, you know, our personhood is almost an antithesis to everything that we talk about. So when I think about like, you know, specifically Black queer trans folks and gender, I'm just like, well, you know, for many of us, we're going to be bred in a certain way. And a lot of our boundaries are already going to be pushed in certain ways because that's just the history of how things have unfolded. You know, so yeah, it's been really interesting to think about, especially right now, especially with the way that we've seen a major uptick with regards to the states and like their pushes to like, you know, attempt to erase trans folks and attempt to like criminalize and punish trans folks for just existing. So yeah, I'll just stop there for now.
No, thank you so much, Avatara. That was fantastic, and I think that you know, that tension between visibility and privacy for trans folk, for queer folk, for in particular queer BIPOC folk is a topic that I hope we'll continue to explore. I want to give the other panelists just to jump in to build off Avatara's comments if they like to. Go ahead, Gabriel.
I mean, so Avatara, it's interesting with the ID cases, because we do often bring privacy claims in those cases, right? So we'll argue that when the state forces me to have an ID that says F on it, then that means, you know, I'm not just being misgendered anytime I use it, but I'm also being outed as trans anytime I use it, because they look at my ID and they look at me and they draw a certain conclusion. And our opposing counsel will make arguments like, oh, but aren't you proud to be trans? Aren't you actually out as trans to some people? And so then we're put in a position of trying to argue, well, yeah, you know, it's not about whether I'm proud of being trans, it's about whether if I'm pulled over in the road, do I want the police officer in that moment to see that I'm trans in this particular way? Like, is that going to be safe? And different people in our communities have very different answers. Like, Black trans people are much more likely to experience violence in those situations than I would as a white trans person. But then it's also, and even those privacy arguments have their limitations, right? Because if we are going to be pushing for people to get access to a gender that lists something other than M or F, then the outing argument doesn't work quite as well, right? Because if you see an X and people assume that you're non-binary, then we're not sort of arguing for something that makes you more visible, right? As opposed to something that makes you less visible, which which makes things more complicated for that particular legal argument. It's one of those limitations there.
Yeah, and just to build off that, Gabriel, I mean, I think, definitely privacy, as you know better than I, in your amazing work advocating and fighting for trans people in the courts, has been an important an important legal tool, as you just underscored. But like so many legal tools, it's also really limited, and we've seen this debate and this tension sort of recur throughout many social movements, many social legal movements, right? Like what are the trade-offs between fighting for short-term inclusion or inclusion on the master's terms versus long-term broader emancipation, right? And so a lot of queer legal activists have fought for better access to stripping down the requirements to get to get an M or an F on an ID document, right? But the box is still limiting. It's still controlling. And do you think we just have to embrace the fact that we're in some ways enshrining the boxes to a certain degree, and that does have limitations, or should we move away from advocating for greater access and freedom to the boxes and advocating for dismantling categories altogether? And I'll start that with Gabriel, but very much interested in everyone's perspectives.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's one, of course, that's been debated in a lot of spaces for a lot of time. Um, I mean, I initially, before I graduated law school and started working with a lot of different trans people, just from my own experience, I was like, we should take sex off ID. There's no reason to have sex on ID. It just causes problems for so many different people. But then actually, when I started working with a lot of low-income Latina trans women, one of the things that struck me was that a lot of them were asking if we would at least issue them some ID that listed them as female, because in some of the different like violent single-sex spaces that they had to navigate, like having anything that acknowledged who they were sometimes made it easier and safer for them to just get through those spaces. Anything, whether it's a public restroom or whether it's a homeless shelter or whether it's like a welfare office where you have to use the bathroom, right? It's just and so that really shifted my thinking, that for some people having ID that lists your gender accurately can be a tool for self-advocacy and can be a tool for survival, um, and made me think it's actually probably unwise to totally take it away. What I what personally where I am at the moment, and I continue to shift my thinking on this over time, and I'm interested to hear what other people think, um, is that I think sex should be an optional field. I think people should be able to say, I want sex listed on my ID or not. And if it is going to be listed, I should be able to say how it's going to be listed. Um, but I don't know. I don't know if that's actually the best answer, but that's kind of the best answer I have at the moment.
Other perspectives on this particular question?
Hi. Yeah. Hi. Thanks for convening us, Scott, and thanks Avatara and Gabriel for getting the conversation started on this inclusion point. And the kind of dichotomy that gets set up between this kind of a particular kind of like wholesale refusal and versus a kind of negotiation within the system. I often find it a little often untractable, like intractable as a question. And instead, I like to think about like, well, what is the work that inclusion, that the idea and the term of inclusion is doing at a given moment? Like, how is it structuring relationships between differently situated individuals? And when I say differently situated, I mean like hierarchically according to relations of power and so on. And outside of the ID example, I've thought about this a bit in the context of the design of online platforms, and I know that the digital privacy was a big theme in the previous panel. And I think in particular about there was sort of some recent-ish in the last few years developments for the on the dating app Tinder. This is an example I like to go to, but for folks that don't know, Tinder is a dating app or a hookup app, and it's primarily structured around sort of your kind of like gut reaction to images, and you swipe one way if you find somebody's profile picture desirable, and you swipe the other way if not. And what sort of Tinder learned over the course of sort of its first handful of years of existence, first few years of existence, was that this was causing some this was resulting in some harm to in particular folks with some non-normative gender presentations, and so you had an instance where a trans woman, a straight trans woman, would be on the site, would go in and identify by binary categories that they were offered. I'm a woman, I'm looking to date men, and then there would be cisgender men who would be scrolling through and they would see a woman that to them they were like, oh, this isn't a real, quote unquote, real woman, or they that kind of toxic and harmful stereotype, and then they would report these profiles as fraudulent. Like they wouldn't just like skip past, they would like literally report them as like, this is not a real woman. And then initially Tinder got in trouble because the process of like dealing with sort of claims of fraud was automated. And so, after a certain number of claims, you got a warning email, and then after a certain number of claims, you got banned, you got locked out of the site. So there was these trans women that were being locked out of their accounts. Because they were the automated process was agreeing with the assessment, whether or not on purpose, right? Was agreeing with the assessment by these cis straight men that these women were fraudulent. And so eventually they expanded a set of categories that people could use to identify themselves and also to indicate who they were interested in dating and who they were interested in having see their profile. So this is a kind of a privacy intervention, right? Like it allowed people to sort of mediate their visibility on the site and filter their engagements on the site in particular ways. And this was like really largely met as like a sort of boon for inclusion. It was sort of universally celebrated by queer orgs and celebrities and some activists. And I don't want to deny the fact that like in the sort of like day-to-day interaction with the site, that's going to like reduce harm. I don't want to deny that. But there's a broader scheme here where this move to inclusion, by sort of designing the site in this way, kind of offloads the work of visibility, of managing one's visibility. It offloads it onto the sort of the affected parties. And then on the platform side, you reap a set of benefits, whether they're economic, because more fine-grained data on your users can be useful for targeting particular things or can be useful for resale. Political benefits, insofar as like you can show that, look, we're doing this, you don't need to regulate us, or you get third-party organizations who watchdog orgs who might otherwise be your critics to celebrate you, right? There's a set of social benefits that come with that, and political benefits, and then like awards and good press and accolades. So there's like this tremendous set of benefits that accrues because of this inclusion move. And then there's a set of kind of like not insignificant, but certainly not monetarily or otherwise like significant benefits that accrue to the people who are harmed in the first place. And as Avatara pointed out already, it's usually the same parties that are having to like come to platforms and say like, this design is harming us, right? Like we're the ones like constantly raising the issue, and then we're given new tools while all of these other benefits accrue. So this is what I think about in the context of inclusion, is like how is it structuring or restructuring relationships, and who's carrying the burden of sort of like raising the issue of inclusion, and then who is reaping the sort of broader economic and political benefits of those moves towards inclusion. And I find that to be that's the lens that I often pick up, rather than thinking in this dichotomous sense of like, do we refuse, do we navigate within the system?
I think that's really helpful, Anna. And I think that I think that sort of approach to it could have value in the law reform context, because I do think, you know, and I don't mean to set up a false dichotomy, but I do think that law reform advocates often think in some of those terms, right? You know, like what are the short-term benefits? Like, are there harm reduction benefits? You know, yes, we should try to capture those. And I think privacy scholarship more generally, you know, needs to think more about harm reduction, but you know, also trying to at least keep one eye on what's being and who is being excluded. But you're absolutely right that I love that frame, thinking about you know, burdens of inclusion as opposed to, you know, sort of an on and off switch. I find that really helpful. So thank you. Any reactions to Anna's powerful example?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to jump in. And again, thank you so much, Scott, and Gabriel, and Avatara, and Anna. I'm so happy to be in dialogue with y'all. Yeah, I mean, building a bit on what Anna's saying, and, you know, thinking about what the kind of dynamics of inclusion are. I mean, I think, you know, pulling it back and I mean, less in the law reform frame, more in the sort of design of socio-technical systems frame, is kind of thinking about, you know, what we lose when we're included, or what's at stake when we kind of give into it, into kind of modes of inclusion. And so, for instance, you know, a lot of my work more recently has been looking at computer vision technologies, and you know, in computer vision technologies, this is stuff that includes facial recognition, but it's also stuff like facial analysis, facial classification, gender classification. And I mean, this has ramifications for a lot of different spheres. It's not only facial recognition kind of gets the most play, but because it's very visible, it has very direct ties to law enforcement and policing. But there's also kind of these other areas in which things are deployed in different ways. So for instance, gender classification in technology, for instance, can be deployed in kind of multiple different domains. You could think of, you know, situations in which I think this might have been deployed in maybe one of the Emirate states, one of the Gulf Arab states, where you know, there are sex segregated facilities and things like train cars or washrooms. And you know, there's talk there of deploying some of these things and restricting individual entry into places based on some kind of automated gender recognition or automated gender classification. And this is very much relevant to the sort of kind of applications that Avatara is talking about when you're thinking about state level laws around restrooms and access to sport. And so these technologies are sort of, you know, tested and evaluated in various different ways, either from commercial AI that does kind of gender classification, or some kind of also these data sets through which these evaluations are done. And so one of my collaborators, for instance, Morgan Klaus-Schauerman, who was an intern with me last year, has done some amazing work around evaluating some systems that do gender classification, and has shown gender classification systems, commercial gender classification systems, perform much more poorly on trans folks. They are sort of nonsensical for non-binary folks. And he's gone through and also looked at these evaluation data sets, which look at do some kind of gender or racial classification and find how they define these things. And so there's kind of a mode of inclusion that kind of gets deployed here. So some folks in the kind of computer science or AI domain looked at this work and said, oh, you know what we actually need is that we actually need like a non-binary gender classifier. And you're like, no, 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 that's not what we want. Like, this is not like, because, you know, if you're going to build a non-binary, you know, a trinary gender classifier, what it's going to end up doing is you're going to have male, female, and non-binary. And, you know, first, it's nonsensical to even talk about non-binary gender classification, much more so than doing so for male and female. And also, who do you think, you know, the archetypical non-binary person is probably going to be like a white assigned female at birth person. And so like this is going to like perpetuate a particular sort of like notion of what like a non-binary person looks like, that and really entrench that things that we've already seen in other socio-technical systems of entrenching, you know, who's an engineer, who's a homemaker, all these other things. And so, you know, like I really appreciate thinking about and deconstructing this idea of inclusion and thinking about like, well, is inclusion the right frame? You know, like what does this actually mean, and what are ways of kind of resisting and thoughts on that. So from there, I sort of, you know, I sort of have been playing with two concepts lately, and the first one is thinking about kind of resistance and sort of a way of thinking about, well, not only understanding, you know, being transparent about how these decisions are made, but also finding ways to challenge them and contest them, and that work for particular types of people. And so one concept that some collaborators and I have sort of been thinking through is the idea of contestation, especially contestation in design, especially socio-technical systems. This is an idea that sort of draws on somewhere from Deirdre Mulligan and Ted Hurst, that kind of goes beyond thinking just about contesting, being transparent or thinking about things being accountable, but rather thinking about, you know, what engagement looks like, what does it mean for a predictive algorithm, how is it actually going to support people, you know, and in some way it's getting past, you know, like let's crack open this black box and sort of see what's inside of it. But it also has, this concept also has kind of important limits, also because it sort of makes the onus of making things contestable sort of in the realm of like the designer. Um, and and I find that limiting, because I sort of critiques of design have been made from Lily Irani and Ruha Benjamin, who have called design, frankly, colonizing, frankly, very Western in nature, being posed to other modes of thinking. And so, you know, something I've sort of thought about more lately is this idea of more of complaint. And this is coming more from Sarah Ahmed's work on complaint. And the idea of thinking about what complaint does in thinking through different organizational arrangements. And so, you know, she said, to complain within an organization often brings you up against it. In making the complaint, one has to teach themselves about how the university, in this sense, she's talking about university complaints, but how the organization works, and how it's failed its own policies and procedures in relation to quality and dignity. And so I really think that's helpful. And kind of the sociologist in me kind of reaches back and says, okay, what's the work of complaint? What's the work of reaction? And, you know, you have to learn a whole different language to make a complaint, right? Of an organization. You know, there's a lot of fuck shit happening at Google right now. I'm learning a lot about the organization of Google and understanding, you know, how to properly lodge a complaint, right? And so, and I think that's sort of a helpful analytic, I think, especially for folks who are challenging these organizations and these systems which perpetuate violence.
So that was super rich, Alex. Thank you, and a lot in there. I might just to, you know, it's interesting. I mean, we have people here from different sort of disciplines and professional backgrounds, and I think that provides us some opportunities. And one thing, Gabriel and Avatara, maybe I'd love to get your reactions to what Anna and Alex were saying. In particular, two themes. One is, you know, and this Anna didn't mention this term, but part of her scholarship focuses on this concept of data violence, and that these systems are doing, you know, real harm to queer people, and she described those harms without using that term. And I guess, you know, from the perspective of a you know, a legal services provider, right? You know, where your clients, you know, may be concerned about data violence, but are also concerned about, you know, like physical violence. Like, do you find that this, do you find that framing is helpful or creates a false equivalency? And relatedly, like, you know, it's interesting hearing Alex talk about complaints. Gabriel, like in the prison context, as you know, like the PLRA, like there's procedures for filing proper complaints, and those procedures are where complaints go to die. You know, and so I'm wondering if your experience with complaints in a more embodied context might provide some insight to what Alex is thinking about.
Should I start? Okay. So, well, I mean, so I think all of these things are related, and sometimes maybe even talking about the same thing. I mean, one of the first things that comes to mind when I think about privacy and trans people and legal rights is just I mean, over the course of history in European and US law, there have been these quote unquote gender checks, which are really genital checks, strip searches of trans people to see what we have between our legs. And I mean, you can see examples of these being ordered by various tribunals in 1500 Spain and 1600s Virginia. And you can also see news stories from this year, from 2021, about trans people subjected to strip searches just for the purposes of seeing what's between their legs in various in contexts where people are dealing with police or when they're in jail. Um, and you know, the courts give a lot of deference to law enforcement and prisons to do a lot of things in terms of searches. Even so, in general, the premise is that they're supposed to be looking for contraband or something, right? Not just literally looking for somebody's genitals. But that said, while there's been some litigation on it with some decent settlements, I mean, there's not really a lot of good case law on this so far. And it just keeps happening, even though we have gotten some policies put in place saying that these things shouldn't happen. It's in the Prison Rape Elimination Act regulations, these things shouldn't happen. They continue to happen. And also, I mean, still in the sort of criminal context, there's a case several years ago in New York where a homeless trans woman was on the street looking at a purse. Police searched her. They found that the purse was stolen and charged her, and she tried to get that evidence suppressed because there was no legal basis for the search. And the trial court said, sure, that's right, trans people exist. Seeing a trans woman on the street looking in a purse is not probable cause. But the appellate court said, no, look at the mugshot. This person had some visible stubble. Seeing a man look in a purse is probable cause for a search because men do not carry purses unless they've just stolen them, right? So privacy law in those contexts should be protecting trans people, but it really isn't, or at least not in reality or not consistently enough. Um, and and I and so I mean, and then there's this whole other level of surveillance where law enforcement is using facial recognition, including gender categorization, to try to apprehend more people, or reading people's social media profiles to try to find evidence of crimes. Um, and I sometimes, as a lawyer, have been in a position of wanting to get more data about how trans people are treated in criminal legal systems. Like I want to be able to see what's happening to be able to better build a case, because sometimes we have people saying, well, there just aren't enough trans people to even worry about, or, oh, the things that you're saying happen in prisons, jails don't really happen. So sometimes I want that data, but every time that I have, almost every time, this, I'm not universalizing too much, but almost every time when I've spoken to an organization that is led by trans people of color who have been criminalized or incarcerated, they're like, you want what? You want to tell the cops to ask us what? No, thank you. Like, in what world do you think it would be safe for us to get asked whether we're trans when we've just been arrested, right? So I think the questions um, that Alex is raising about, what does inclusion do is really important in this context. Like, like there may be some benefits, but there are also some really significant harms. And even if I think it would be nice to get the data, I feel like if it comes down to it, that a person's going to be in more danger in the moment that the data is collected, then I don't want us to do it. I mean, that analysis is going to be context to context. But in this context, I think the less data law enforcement has, probably the better.
No, I mean, I was just going to go off of that, Gabriel, when you're speaking, because I was just thinking about it. I think that so often, the response of folks to state violence is like, well, the more data we collect, the better able we are in terms of like approaching or navigating how to address this problem. And I agree in many ways. I just, and again, it comes back to like exactly the conversation that's unfolding here is like, but at what cost? Because you have to recognize that at that point, especially in these specific contexts, you're putting people in closer proximity to violence, because in a way, naming who you are in that moment allows for people to then decide how they want to treat you, whether it's based off of their first perception or now having additional information. And then again, like, what does it then look like to also have those points, like those data points follow you into different systems? Because I think that when we talk about it, coming back to the driver's license is like, for me personally, because I know that like I will never be gendered correctly in an interaction with most people. It's like, okay, so like I could for myself like opt into having an X, but that also invites further conversation. And then what does it look like to have that marker follow me in different places? Because in some spaces I actually might be in closer proximity to safety. In some spaces I might actually be guaranteed a little bit more privacy. In other spaces I'm actually like opening myself up to an onslaught of violence that I'm just like, I actually would rather not. Like, I actually would like to opt out. And so, kind of, coming back to that point, I think it's like really interesting when we talk about that, especially in the context of privacy, because again, I guess like I always come back to like, what does privacy look like to who, and like, why does it look like that? And like, in what ways can we talk about, again, how certain people are already kind of like pushing the boundaries where they will never be they will never be able to claim privacy in the way that most people think of it colloquially. So yeah.
That's super helpful. And I think both of those examples that you both provided in some ways underscore Anna's point, which is like the burdens of inclusion are falling on the people whom inclusion is purportedly designed to benefit. So that really, I think that resonates really well with Anna's point. Any other thoughts on this topic before we pivot a little bit? I do think, and this next question, I'll start with Alex, and I think we've Avatara in particular touched on this, but there's a tension, right, between ensuring access to digital networks, which are key to queer communities and queer identity formation, right? but those same contexts, and Anna's Tinder example underscores this too, become where mediums of connection can become weaponized, right, to harm sexual and gender minorities. And so, Alex, in particular, given your position at working for our benevolent master, how could we take measures, you talked a little bit about contestation within the industry itself, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how we as individuals can take measures to resist having our networked lives be rendered by Google and other tech capitalists.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, this is a pressing question, and I mean, I guess my initial sort of thoughts on this are thinking about the kind of, I mean, different modes of kind of identification and datafication. And I mean, I'm kind of curious, like, it's interesting that Anna brings up the Tinder example, because thinking about sort of different kinds of architectures of, that are sort of anti-data collection in some kinds of ways. I'm actually thinking about, there was this social, it's since become like a social network, but there was like an Instagram account called Lex for a certain amount of time, which was, like basically, and it was sort of anti-classification in nature. And so in some senses, it was like, you would post some kind of ad, and it was kind of like an old school personal, and you would just write the text, and you really didn't have to identify at all. Like you could write whatever you wanted in the ad, and there was no kind of architecture of kind of data collection. And I mean, there's other problems with that platform, which we don't have to go into now, but it was kind of an interesting kind of mode in which, this kind of self-identification, and disclosure as one wanted to present in a sort of, I want to say libidinal economy, but I also don't know what that means. So like but in sort of, these kind of network of desire, basically kind of like and sort of this way of kind of pushing back against that. And I mean, and the more and more, you sort of do these histories of kind of the early trans internet and early queer, networks, this sort of, there's this tendency to push back much more against these sort of ways of organizing and identification, both for safety reasons, but also for sort of like knowing that the kind of identities are queer and fluid and whatnot. And so, there's folks who have done a lot of great work on that. Kate McKinney is someone that comes to mind, who's done some great work on that. And then the question becomes like, well, how do you sort of change the arrangement when it comes to these networks like Google, like YouTube, like Facebook, and the kind of flip side of Anna's example on Facebook is that, Facebook was heralded, a couple of years ago when they added, I think, something like 51 gender categories. But at the end of the day, it actually reduced to like male or female. And, basically because, Facebook's an ad network, they need to market to male and female, like that's what the, in the world in which you can hyper specify identity, male and female are still useful advertiser networks. The same thing happened with Google, I think a few months ago, when it was revealed that they added a non-binary category, but then that was actually excluding people from certain advertising networks. And so like, in some sense, that kind of exposure could be seen as like a kind of a backwards like win. Like you're not actually advertised to, so you're actually in some ways, by virtue of being non-binary, kind of opting out, but it is, what kind of benefits are you losing out and not being legible to a system like that? And so, what does it actually mean in this, and there's other examples in which, being identified as trans or gender nonconforming is, in some senses advantageous. So one case on digital networks where this has very, very deep monetary effects is YouTube monetization. So YouTube encountered, I think, a lot of criticisms because some YouTubers, trans YouTubers, were doing things like, they were posting their transitions on YouTube, and they would, and they put the word trans or LGBTQ in the title, and YouTube was actually demonetizing that, and YouTube actually has very little idea of how to actually present that content to children, and will sometimes exclude that content in children. And so, on one level, actually identifying as being trans is, advantageous for, let's say, benevolent benevolent overlords, including my employer, that would be actually wants to try to combat that, but at the same time, putting oneself out as trans on the internet is, surely, becomes a very quickly a vector of abuse and harassment, and in this kind of, what I think Avatara put very well, this kind of dichotomy of being both hyper visible and invisible at the same time. And so, these are real questions. And I mean, there's not really easy answers, but, we're seeing so many instances in which trans and gender nonconforming folks are just falling through the cracks in these systems.
I think that the Facebook example is super powerful to me, and it illustrates, I think, part of Anna's critique of inclusion efforts or narratives, because it's like, even if you even if the public facing options are broad, right, and they're trying to appear inclusive, what's being done on the back end? Are those identities being aggregated? Okay, so that the people are being classified in ways they don't want to anyway for advertising purposes, or just as harmful potentially, being excluded. And one thing I've been thinking about just a little bit, actually, and mostly in the context of being a recent member of the committee that puts on the Privacy Law Scholars Conference, is we it has traditionally not been a very, it's been a very homogenous community. And so in an effort to think about holding ourselves accountable to changing that, and changing the culture going forward, one topic that's come up is like, okay, well, how do we measure over time, okay, without just like, sort of gut reactions like, oh, we are now more diverse. Like hold the program committee accountable over time for making a more inclusive environment, or welcoming environment. And so it's like, okay, well, should we start gathering data on who comes? And then, the question is like, well, then what questions do we ask? And then it's like, well, if we ask really broad questions, okay, basically allowing people to provide information that they think is relevant, does that actually allow us to track over time? And I think that requires thinking critically about how we present data, right? Like, it doesn't need to be some bar graphs, right? Like, it could be a word map or word clusters or something, that captures the richness of a community, rather than trying to squeeze people into boxes on the back end. And obviously that's easier to do with small data sets like a conference, right? You're dealing with a couple hundred people, but I wonder if thinking about data presentation and data arrangement on the back end in more creative ways may, particularly visual ways of displaying data, might provide some avoid some of the back end problems that are illustrated by your Facebook example, Alex. I don't know if you have a reaction to that at all, or anybody.
I just, yeah, I'll build on that too. I just want to note though, like one of the things that this conversation can a path that it can lead us down, or a kind of discursive construction it can trap us in, is this idea that like there are going to be like sort of good technologies or bad technologies, that we're going to have these buckets of like good, this is a quote unquote good data practice, this is a quote unquote bad data practice, this is a good privacy policy, this is a bad one, and we're gonna fall into this like this like binaristic moralizing trap that we fall into with inclusion as well. And I always come back to this, but it instead of sort of sorting these efforts or initiatives or boxes, or even more sort of simplistic technologies like gender categories on a identity document, right? That's a technology. An identity document is a technology. Is to think about, again, like what kind of relationships do they organize? I was just reading the introduction to Max Leboiron's new book, Pollution is Colonialism. It was just released, and they have a joke in the intro about paperwork being, how could paperwork ever be liberatory, right? As like a technology, like how paperwork is colonization. Paperwork is colonization. It's oppressive. Why do we have to do paperwork? And they point out that there are examples of paperwork required by, say, indigenous research ethics boards that actually serve to slow down and interrupt the function or the operation of sort of settler colonial scientific practices, going into particular communities, extracting data, or using particular lands to conduct research, right? And how then paperwork and ticking boxes and these things can then become a tool to sort of slow down the operation of power in that way, of oppressive forces in that way. And I just like, I want to like kind of come back to is like what relationships does something like a gender category codified, whether it's on a platform or on an identity document, what relationships is it structuring? And who is vulnerable in those instances, and how could it be otherwise? And that to me is rather than kind of slipping into these like, well, this would be a good practice, this would be the bad practice. Well, no, these are tools, and we can use them to slow down those who would do us harm.
I appreciate that, pushing back on the binary, there being like things that are definitely good and there are things that are definitely bad. And I think both that data collection practices are much more nuanced, and we're not going to come up with like some perfect data practice or things that are in every circumstance always going to be bad. And I also think that sometimes there's so much focus on collecting identity information when that's not actually necessarily the thing that we want to measure. Like in this instance, in the example that Scott gave us, maybe what we want to be measuring is something about gender and racial equity at this particular conference or something. And you can maybe get some measure of that by sort of counting the identities of people who are organizers or speakers or attendees. But you're certainly not going to get a very holistic vision of the experience of equity, right? And I feel like we also should challenge ourselves in these situations to think about ways that we can measure the systems rather than measure the individuals who are interacting with the systems, at least some of the time, right? Which is a concept that I'm borrowing from Data for Black Lives. But I mean, are there ways that we can look at what the conference organizers are doing, what the physical space is like, what the topics are that are discussed, what the experiences of inclusion, belonging, violence, exclusion, etc. are, rather than just counting how many people from particular categories showed up and calling that equity. not that that doesn't matter. I think actually in some instances we do want to count some around identities, and there's no perfect way to do it. And I am really interested in the idea of different sorts of data visualizations that could make more sort of self-describe options more workable, at least in smaller data sets. But I also want to challenge us to think more holistically when we're trying to measure something about equity.
Super helpful. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to our first questioner, who's a student here at Colorado Law. Nick, are you there? Great.
Yep.
Hey, hi, Nick. Nick Matera, thanks so much for joining us. And by all means, let's have your question.
Well, first, thank you very much for this awesome discussion. I think it's really important that we're having panels like this. I was hoping to sort of ask, I guess this question is more directed toward Gabriel and the public policy side. We talked in this panel a lot about safeguarding these environments for online environments for individuals to explore their identity, but the double-edged sword of that those environments can fuel violence or abuse and disenfranchisement. I think Professor Skinner-Thompson, you said the burdens of inclusion are falling on those that inclusion is designed to benefit. So Gabriel, because you're operating in the legal community, I was wondering if there are public policy solutions, at least on the table, like the Equality Act, that are addressing these issues. Are policymakers ready to have that conversation, or what you were saying before is case law sort of where the ground floor needs to be established?
Well, I'm also interested in other folks' thoughts on this, especially Avatara, who's also in the law and policy world. I mean, so this is, I mean, there are a lot of different types of violence and exploitation that can happen, at least in part, online. Um, in my particular work, what I'm most aware of and concerned about is when the government or large businesses are using people's statements about who they are, who they associate with, et cetera, against them in some way, whether that's for purposes of criminalization or job discrimination or something else. And in terms of policy solutions, I mean, so the Equality Act will do more to make it illegal in more contexts to discriminate against people. Um, there are currently gaps in federal law, particularly around public accommodations and certainly in certain federally funded services where there's really not much of any protections, and there could be. Um, but of course, even when we have laws that are making discrimination illegal, that doesn't mean the discrimination stops. Unfortunately, it's been against the law for a long time, for example, to discriminate in employment against Black people or people with disabilities, but unfortunately that's still really common. That doesn't mean that those things are not worth doing. And I think there are actually a lot of different ways that we can do that. One of the public policy things that I think is particularly important and exciting in trans law right now is the push to decriminalize sex work, which has a lot of implications in when we're talking about digital spaces. Right now, there's a federal law that has taken away most of the online tools that sex workers have used to find and screen clients and to sort of help each other stay safe. So I think that public policy that takes away some of the criminal penalties that right now are used against people in digital spaces is really important. And I mean, there are a number of other measures that people can take, and I'm just going to be honest that I'm also not somebody who is deeply familiar with a lot of the intricacies of tech law. So I'll pass it off to my colleagues.
Yeah, I was just gonna quickly jump in. I think that conversations around safety and security, especially when it comes to digital platforms, often deny autonomy to the communities that are actually experiencing that form of violence. That's something that I like realized happening recently with regard to Clubhouse. There was like a conversation around, safety, security, and Clubhouse and users, and like people couldn't understand for the life of them why certain people would be signing up for Clubhouse. And I'm like, actually, if you think about, historically, storytelling based communities, so specifically speaking about like Black communities that are like, have a rich tradition in like, oral storytelling, whether, oral or written, whatever. I've seen like an amazing way that people have come together on Clubhouse to talk about things, especially with regard to gender and sexuality. And although we can acknowledge that there are definitely violent spaces there where, the same conversations that are going to happen outside of Clubhouse are going to happen on Clubhouse, it's been interesting to watch community navigate how to actually control that. And so, what I think about so often is that there are folks who come in saying like, oh, what's like the policy response, or what's the response of this specific entity to like this type of violence? And my question is always like, well, have you actually talked to the communities that are experiencing that violence? Because so often everyone wants to jump to like doing something in order to like police it. And what we notice that typically happens is that when we actually create policies, they tend to actually typically silence and cause more violence to the people who are impacted. And that, and sometimes they end up being the ones who are actually like removed from deplatformed, removed and silenced, and this, that, and the third. So that's the first thing that I come back to. But as to what Gabriel was talking about, yeah, my concern honestly when I think about what can happen in terms of like violence in digital spaces usually comes back to the state. And it's like, how is the state actually, surveilling, collecting, distributing this information for the benefit of their own goals that often lead to like, criminalization and all this other stuff. And I think that that's a conversation that like, I don't know, it's so interesting because I feel like that's one that people sometimes shy away from. They just rather think about like interpersonal violence as something to address. I'm like, actually, let's talk about the state, because that's actually where the issue lies. Because often in the ways that they criminalize people, that's how you see communities actually start to criminalize and police and surveil their people as well. And then there's a natural flow there.
Absolutely. Thank you both, Gabriel and Avatara. Another audience question, this one from my church colleague, Margot Kaminsky. And when Alex was talking, I immediately thought of Margot, and so was glad to see this question. Margot, Alex is interested in more in the difference between contestability versus contestation, and put differently, what is the difference and the different values of allowing contestation, in the boardroom or in the design room, so to speak, versus allowing people to contest their own identities as as generated or portrayed by tech communities. And do you think both approaches are necessary, or what are the limitations of these different approaches?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Margot, and thank you. I mean, I think I want to step back and sort of situate this, because there's sort of like kind of the broader conversation. And we just finished this conference this week, which is kind of the big conference in, I don't know what you call this field, AI ethics, fairness, accountability, and transparency. And I think the kind of where this often lands is thinking about these kinds of concepts in kind of in the hands of particular sorts of people who are building these systems. So what does like fairness mean? What does accountability? How do you build that in? Transparency, how do you actually make this transparent? Explainability is another one. And there's a decent amount of academic work that's on looking at what does this mean? What does it mean to actually have something that's explainable? On the facial recognition front, what does it actually point to? And there's sort of certain kind of technical aspects to this where some of these methods will highlight parts of the face or something that highlight it. So I think it's important to understand, like, when framing this idea of like contestability, thinking about who is able to contest it. Maybe a better kind of analog is that's kind of a related concept, is more of the idea of recourse, which I think has a much more kind of understanding, or at least kind of legal definition. So recourse, for instance, if there's, the oh gosh, what is it? The Fair Credit Reporting Act allows you to actually have some kind of recourse, have some kind of explaining of where credit score. And it's probably one of the only sorts of ways where we've seen that kind of policy been translated into kind of things like, now you have a right to actually make some kind of claim of sort of like, what does it mean? What would I have to do to actually change my credit score that would actually increase it? And that gets divided up. This is a lot more vague in the area of, say, computer vision, like where you're saying, well, what would it take to actually, how do I need to change my face to actually have some kind of decision that would not, that's of course not actionable. And so people, and that of course extends to areas of race and gender and whatnot. And so, like, that's, I guess, where the boundaries around contestability lie. I think especially if you're talking about contestability as being designed into a system and allowing users or people to actually kind of contest various outcomes. I mean, I think there's benefits to the idea of it, in a way that I think goes beyond the idea of saying just transparency, which just kind of opens up the black box. But there's also, there's also some limitations to it. And I think, and I think that's sort of, there's different sorts of policy implications, I think, that stem from that too. And I'll drop the kind of the paper by Mulligan et al. Into the chat as well.
I just want to add on that quickly too. I know, to draw this distinction, I think is a theme that runs through a number of comments from the past hours. We need to not conflate self-responsibilization and self-determination as possible ends, right? And so we might have we might make certain kinds of contestability possible, but there's still ultimately sort of your well-being and your opportunities for thriving are still contingent on your ability to contest within the terms sort of presented to you by a dominant policy or structure or order. And how are we supporting modes of life, ways of being, ways of organizing communities, weaving communities that don't exist as like a sub pocket under that framework, but that can thrive and exist alongside and independent and outside of particular regimes. And so I just want to draw that, like that's what I see as like the distinction between self-responsibilization and self-determination is like, to what degree is your ability to contest and to sort of perform and express certain identities sort of contingent on a set of terms given to you versus your ability to do that independent of those terms. And I think that's a key distinction for us to hold on to.
Thanks, Anna. One last question, which I think is, I've seen some nice parallels between, the different structures we're talking about, whether it be the carceral state or, tech capitalists. But one question from the audience deals with, I think question of inclusion on the bench, inspired by Gabriel's example of the trans person's existence being deemed in effect probable cause and criminal. the questioner asks, is that more attributable to the structures or to individual bias on behalf of the judges, or taking Anna's cue and resisting these false dichotomies, all of the above. And I just, I mean, and I'm interested in everybody's responses, but it is interesting. I mean, I just learned yesterday that, for example, I think President Obama or President Biden just nominated the first Muslim person to the federal bench, which is obviously significant, but that's not going to solve much, but it is no doubt of value. And so maybe that example underscores the tension in the question too.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think both and. I think also, Andrea Ritchie and others have done, Jessica Pliley, like there are a number of people who've done work on how policing in the United States it's always been racial and it's always been gendered, right? And those two things have always been together. There was never a time when policing and law enforcement, at least since European conquest, where it has not been about policing gender and sexuality and race. So I think because of individual bias, because of the laws themselves, because of cultural bias, I think all of these things have mutually reinforced each other and are still very much present in a way that people don't always recognize. The laws themselves, some of them specifically name gender, many of them do not, but that doesn't mean that they're not about gender, right? It doesn't mean that they weren't created partly for a gendered purpose. It doesn't mean they're not enforced in gendered ways and interpreted in gendered ways. I do think that who's on the bench matters. It makes a big difference. You can tell just because, Avatara, you can probably speak to this too, but as soon as we get a judge assignment in one of our cases, we're like, all right, either we're golden or it's all over already. Doesn't matter what we do, we've just lost, or something in between, right? So it makes a huge, huge difference who it is, but not just in terms of the identities they hold, but also in the ways that they interpret the law and their concept of what justice means, right? I would love, right now, we've never, as far as I know, had an openly trans person on the federal bench. It would be great if we had that. It would be great if we had a lot of trans people of color. It would be great if we had a Supreme Court that was majority trans people of color. Even if we had that, it wouldn't actually solve all the problems, right? It's so baked into the system in so many different ways that I don't think representation alone will be enough. But I do think that it would be great to have some better representation on the bench.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I wish that, you could hear the thunderous applause I know you would receive for this tremendous conversation. You all are luminaries, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy and in-demand schedules to share your wisdom and grace with us. And so thank you so much, Alex, Avatara, Anna, and Gabriel, for the important work that you're doing, making our world a more just place. And I look forward to continuing to be the beneficiary of all of your efforts. So thank you. And with that, we'll close out this second panel, and we're going to move right to our keynote address before taking a longer break at lunch. So don't go anywhere. I'm going to introduce you to our keynote speaker at this time.